Okay, so let's get started. So essentially, first, just in terms of the mechanics of this discussion. So kind of what will kind of the way I wanted to structure the discussion right now is just first, there will be a bunch of questions that kind of I have and I would like to kind of ask to start of the discussion. But in the meantime, it would be great if you can just if you have any questions, you just put them in chat, and essentially we will start transitioning to them once we get to that phase of the discussion. Okay, so now, okay, so let's get started. So I must say that this topic of social media and in particular content moderation, and I do want to kind of focus a bit more on content moderation because there's just so many questions we might be asking in context of social networks that we might it would be hard to have really a focused discussion. So kind of one thing that I wanted to start off is saying, okay, so what are social networks in some ways you can view it as a reflection of our real world. Okay, I guess they really are merged with our real world. So when we think in this wealth of phenomena that actually arise in the context of social networks, what do you think are the most interesting ones or most important ones we should kind of try to zero in? And I'm saying interesting either because of technical aspects of it, there is something very interesting happening, some interesting, phenomena that we just want to understand its nature, or from societal point of view, just saying that we believe that there is certain behavior that emerges in the context of social media that might be important to understand from the society point of view. So this is kind of just an open-ended question just to get your thinking here. And maybe first we will go with the order of John, Matt, and Lars. So John, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, I think all these questions are going to be very hard to come to any sort of clear view on. And I think, one reason why this topic has such attraction is that when we find ourselves having conversations, even among people who have thought about this, we don't tend to arrive at a consensus, and that suggests there's something challenging going on. And also just because I think there are so many components. So in terms of what are the most important phenomena to understand, I think there's both there's kind of three dimensions to this, right? There's the technical questions, there's kind of empirical social science questions, and then there are normative questions, which I would argue are distinct from both of those. And let me actually go in reverse order. I mean, I think the normative questions are actually, what do we actually want? Suppose we had complete mastery of the technical challenges and we had complete mastery of the empirical social science phenomena. What do we actually want as the outcome as a society is a distinct question from either the technical or the sociological one. And I think it's interesting, obviously it's sort of a well-worn principle that the First Amendment, let me stick to the US here, that the First Amendment limits the power of the government in regulating speech, not private actors, companies, or platforms. And so on the other hand, the philosophical underpinnings of First Amendment jurisprudence, I think, do actually figure in a lot of the discussions that we have in areas that where it doesn't strictly legally apply, and for good reason, because the philosophical underpinnings of the First Amendment were wrestling with very similar questions about what do we want out of a speech or content moderation policy. And it's interesting that when you look at the debates around that, they have a mix of normative, sociological, and technical arguments, even very early on, right? The idea that sort of, free speech is essential to, finding out truth, because we have to have many viewpoints, battle it out in the open in order to determine which is true, is partly a normative statement and partly an empirical one. Similarly, the theory that free speech is essential to the functioning of a democracy because we need multiple viewpoints is sort of one of the normative underpinnings of this. So I think you sort of always have to start with that. You have to ask that solving all the other questions won't magically reveal for us what we actually want as a society. There are sort of reasonable points of difference there. I think on the empirical side, empirical social science side, I think some of the two very big questions, and I think there's a lot of interesting work happening in the last couple of years on this. One is the way in which sort of human behavioral biases are interacting with the technology that we find in internet platforms, right? So, obviously we've gotten our information via technology for a long time, and the opening slide of my talk was, trying to make this argument that even in the 1950s, the study, the sociological study of mass communication really closely grappled with technology, with radio and TV and mass communication, and the ways in which that related to human behavioral principles. And I think similarly, a study of how are different human behavioral biases interacting with the kinds of technological affordances that we see right now is very, very important. You know, and again, you know, I think there's a lot of very good empirical work. Secondly, I think, you know, the question of what does it mean to have a subjectively positive experience on one of these platforms is a sort of distinct question, you know, to how we consume information. I think, you know, Lars's talk makes very clear that, you know, it would be, you know, we shouldn't think of these as platforms where we go because we're in need of a new dose of sort of objective information, and we go to the platform and we receive it. We're there also to get a subjectively positive experience from engaging with, with close friends, with more distant friends, with people that we're trying to keep up with in our lives. And, you know, what are the components that create something that feels subjectively positive to people, I think is another important empirical question. And then finally, I think on the technical side, you know, obviously the question of how, you know, sort of algorithms that may seem very similar might produce very different outcomes in the kind of equilibria that you get when they filter content, I think is something that we also have very limited understanding of at the moment, and is also a very important question. So that'd be sort of a kind of, you know, in those three dimensions, how I think about some of the most important questions. And of course, there are many others.
Yeah, great. So that was a good summary of, yeah, exactly. And also the reason why we will, you know, we run out of time for sure in this discussion if you wanted to dig into some of it. But like, I think this is an interesting point I just want to highlight. It's just like, it's not clear what the users really expect from social media. Like maybe they don't view it, okay, this is the place where I find truth, but there is something else that they really kind of expect. And maybe, you know, that's maybe one part that we might want to think about and kind of control for and design for. So anyway, Matt?
Yeah, so I think we could talk about this particular question all day long. So it's a tough one to bite off just small pieces of, because I think there's so much that's being changed at this point in time, and it's hard to get a handle on all the pieces. But let me just bite off a couple of them. And I think, you know, one thing that is different about what's happening now than what happened previously is it's putting people in personal contact at greater distances with more people at the same time. So it's sort of amplifying our personal social networks in ways that weren't, you know, telephone did some of that. Letter writing was an innovation that made it, but I think the scale of this one is pretty unique. And that allows us to reach more people at greater distances. And so it's changing our networks in some ways. And I think the hard part is that it's also being mediated by the AI that is making decisions and offering us content. As Lars was going through, you know, there have to be made choices of how do you order things, how do you present people with choices, and that interaction is something that we really need to understand in detail. And let me point out one, I think, important aspect of human interactions that we underappreciate. And sociologists call this multiplexing. And multiplexing refers to the fact that we have many different things that we do with people at the same time. So for instance, I often talk to my work colleagues about questions that are completely unrelated to work, because they're people I'm interacting with all the time. And so I'm gonna have a conversation about what movie to watch or what car to buy or where to take my children for something. That's something that I would tend to have with the people I'm interacting with, even though they might not be the best people for that purpose. And what happens is, as Lars was also pointing out on things like news feeds, is all these different interactions get mixed up at the same time. So I'm getting information about somebody's cat videos, and then I'm also getting information about their political views, and I'm getting all this from the same people at the same time, and that's difficult to sort through. So there's this multiple types of interactions, and platforms can be optimized for one and good for one and not necessarily good for another. And I think part of the difficulty is that we're interacting in complicated ways with multiple different objectives at the same time, and that's all being mediated through these. One other thing that I think is really important, and I think that we underappreciate, is how this is fundamentally changing journalism. And I think that that's something that's really important. So if we get to the question that John was just asking about, you know, what are the kinds of normative things that we care about? One of the reasons we care about free speech and we care about having open sources of information is that we want good information production, and we want that as a guardian of our welfare against states doing bad things or people doing bad things. We want to make sure that systems are working properly. That takes deep investigative journalism. And one difficulty that we face is that I think what we're getting these days is we get an enormous amount of very quick and somewhat shallow information. It's not clear that the incentives in the new marketplace are for people to do 2-year-long deep journalistic investigations that then get rebroadcast and easily it's very difficult to get the revenue from. I spent 2 years investigating what was going on in some congressional district, and now I publish it and it's rebroadcast everywhere, and I don't get much of the rewards for that. So I think that the way in which news spreads these days is changing the way it's being produced. And that's something that we really need to understand as well. So it's not just what's happening in terms of the spreading, but it's what's happening in terms of the production. And I think that's a deep question that we don't have a good answer for at this point in time.
Great, thank you. So yes, so one thing that you kind of touch on here, actually, that two I just want to call out. Two of the topics is one of them is incentives. That like they're kind of, and in general, there's all these long-term effects. Kind of that sometimes just the change of it's not only about how the network works, but also how it changes the behavior of all the participants. And some of these things, by changing the incentives, can be very long range. So yeah, so that's exactly like a particular economics angle that I think well, that's something you can learn from economics, thinking about this kind of second and third and order effects that show up. Thank you, Lars. What are your thoughts here?
I think in many ways my answer is going to be similar to what Matt sort of ended with there. I think in some ways we focused a lot, and I think have a reasonable, good understanding of kind of some of the challenges at the sort of like last stage of there's a pool of inventory that's available to show people, whether it's on social media or some other platform, and we have to select which things, and there's kind of like trade-offs and policy questions and a lot of complexity, and it's like kind of an ongoing problem, but it's in some ways well understood. Versus, I think that the thing that is much more difficult is to think about these sort of like both short and longer term incentives that are being created by the systems, and how that those sort of incentives to a large extent are shaping what content ends up in the systems. Whether it's the economic incentives for journalists, or it's other sort of incentives in terms of creators creating content and just want to sort of like reach more people and get more engagement, or in which the sort of ranking and that happens within each of these systems has longer term repercussions that are just kind of like difficult to reason about, both because they're happening on a network, but also because they take a long time, and it's hard to sort of like know how to actually do that attribution. Where I agree with the point that you made, of sort of like it's the economics thinking and thinking about all of the incentives that are being created and what that leads to in the long run. Where I feel like there's a lot of opportunity to sort of like deepen our understanding.
Great, thank you. So yeah, so essentially, that was a great way of thinking this is what I find is in my own kind of learning about this topic, is that there are like this first order concerns, and then only once you think it more more on this, you unearth, okay, but there's also this, there's also this, and there's also this. And again, my usual way of dealing with such things is just still a focus on try to abstract away or just forget about this other aspects and just try to focus on one question. And one question I would like to kind of try to push us a little bit in this discussion, just in the also in concert with the theme of this event, is actually this effect of mis or disinformation. That this is if you talk about social networks in the media, that's what kind of gets the most attention about kind of the role, the role or the supposed role of how social media fuel the spread of let's say misinformation. And kind of one thing that I am always wondering here is just okay, so this kind of goes back to John's point that it's not clear what people actually expect from social media, okay? And it's not clear that they really expect, okay, I learn about the world from Facebook or from Twitter, maybe I just go there to have fun, or just like see something funny, something that entertains me, or just like seeing how my friends are doing. So in some ways, like one thing that I am curious about, and I would be very curious to hear your thoughts on this, is what is where are we in our understanding of what is the, first of all, the real scale of spread of, let's say, misinformation in social networks? Like how much do we actually know? There's a lot of anecdotal evidence, but I'm not sure how much there's actual data on this, how much spread this is. And also, what is this actual impact on opinion formation? Like, kind of like how big of this is this important? Like how where are we in understanding this question? So maybe, maybe on this, maybe we'll start with Lars, and then with Matt, and then with John.
I think one of the big challenges in answering this question is really defining what we mean by misinformation or disinformation. And I think without that sort of precise definition, it's sort of impossible to answer, like to what extent do we understand it? And I think that's been one of the challenges, certainly, that we've had at Facebook, is sort of both on the like measuring ourselves as to how well we're doing, as well as thinking about constructing policies. And not to say that like we haven't been able to make meaningful progress, and I think we do have a good sort of like understanding for some definitions of misinformation, but I think that's where you often end up sort of seeing different estimates, and where some of the sort of understanding challenges lie is actually less in the measurement, where I think once you have a very precise definition, then you can kind of like, there's various approaches to sample things and to try and have a sort of get a precise understanding of the extent of them. But without that sort of agreed upon, and I guess like this gets to a lot of the kind of like heart of some of the tricky policy questions, like who is the arbiter of truth and who decides sort of what it is misinformation and what is not. But so I think with those sort of caveats, I'd say I think like once you align on the precise definition, then scaling that out is something that I do think we kind of know how to do. And there's various sampling techniques that you can use once you've kind of figured out what that oracle is that tells you like, is this thing disinformation or not? And you can kind of like try to use various, both, I guess, sort of like human resources, as well as some sort of like AI improvements to prioritize what gets labeled in order to get relatively precise estimates. And some of the teams at Facebook have specific goals related to this, and trying to ensure that misinformation doesn't spread. But again, like that's a definition of misinformation, which may or may not be the one that everybody else would sort of agree with.
Yes, so just like, so I think you're right, and again, I just just like deciding what is misinformation versus what is, it's a very, it's definitely a very sensitive topic that like it's kind of like that's merits a separate discussion. But just like I guess I want to understand is that kind of we talk a lot about virality, and there definitely is virality in the networks. The question is kind of okay, so we have. Okay, so I guess what really interests me, and I guess it has to be in the context of probably like political or other news, is saying, there's a connection between, like there's a difference between being exposed to information, to just seeing something, versus this influencing our opinion. So I'm not sure what is the right way to measure it, but I just like, again, this is just a shout out to everyone, or like all three of the speakers. Just like, if we know how the physical spread of information kind of interacts with actually influencing our opinion. And again, if I go to the social network and I just like don't really expect to really believe what's there, I'm just like looking for entertaining stuff, then maybe even if I'm seeing some misinformation, it doesn't really influence much what I'm thinking, and versus when it does. So, and again, it's a complex question. So I just wonder like if we have any actual tools to study it. So I'm not sure if Lars want to weigh into it a little bit, or we can just move to Matt.
I think I'll yield that one to Matt.
Okay, great, Matt, please go ahead.
I mean, I think there's increasing work on that particular question. So, for instance, if you look at my colleague Matt Genskow, they've been doing work on trying to understand to what extent people are swayed by say false news and information that might be false, and also what happens when they're exposed to countervailing attitudes and information, And it, I think a rough caricature of it would be that there seems to be less that it changes people's particular positions and viewpoints, but that exposure can actually make the dialogue less confrontational. So at least being exposed to these things helps you understand what other people think and why they think it, although it might not change your particular perspective. I think, I guess, again, this gets back to these questions of why, what's different now than it was before. And I think, if you look historically, I won't name names, but if you look at the newspapers that people used to read or still read, there's a lot of junk out there in terms of the content that is mostly sensational, and it's mostly entertainment, right? It's news that's not meant to inform people as much as it's meant to keep them entertained. And I think, a lot of what people share and a lot of what people like to share is for humor and fun and other kinds of things. And the amount of it that they're looking for exactly how should I vote in this upcoming election, or, what can I do to improve my life? That's a smaller fraction of what they're looking for. And so I think part of the problem is that this is all mixed together. I think one of the nice things about what we're seeing today is that the tools that we have, the kinds of things that Lars is working with and so forth, allow us to actually experiment with these things, to test these things, to see these things, to measure them. So one thing that's new is we have a tool now which allows us to trace this information, to see it, to see how people are reacting to it, who's sharing it. We're just getting a much more broad and fine-grained picture of what's happening. And so we can begin to ask and answer these questions. We're asking a lot more at this point in time than we're answering. So I think it's going to take us a long time before we get the answers to these things. But we can see a lot more about how humans interact and what their general tendencies are, given the currently available data and the kinds of experiments we can do and so forth with that. So I think that's the encouraging part of what we're seeing.
Great. Thank you, Matt. So, John, what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, so I would agree with a couple of things that Matt said and that Lars said. First, to Matt's point, I mean, right, one thing that's really new is it was remarkably difficult to ask these kinds of questions, about what is the mix of information that people are receiving, what is the effect on what people say before and after they receive this information, right? So again, going back to sort of sociological studies of mass communication, this would be something you would do through interview type methodologies with very, very small sample sizes. Now we can actually do something that actually feels kind of enumerative, right? We can say, what is the actual inventory of potential media out there? What's being selected? So for example, in, I think, one reference that came up earlier was this, this work of Bakshi et al. From Facebook in 2016 on sort of the effect of things like newsfeed. And, and again, I think it was useful to think about it as a kind of series of successive filtrations, right? That there's the global inventory of possible content in the entire system. There's, what's possible because of, what your neighborhood in the network has produced, which filters it. There's what algorithms then surface from that. And then there's what you choose to look at from the things the algorithm has surfaced, right? So think of it as three successive filtrations from an enumeration of everything down to what you're actually consuming. And the fact that we're actually able to separate those three effects is really quite new. And so I think some of that work from 4 or 5 years ago, I think articulated a nice framework for that. I think some of the current work that people like the sort of collaboration of David Rand and Dean Eccles and some of their co-authors has also been very effective, as is some of the work that Matt Kinsko and his co-authors that Matt mentioned. I guess so that's, I think, very important. And then I guess to Lars's point about the definitional challenge here, I think, that's not just, somehow kind of, I think that's actually central. Like, I think we say misinformation with a lack of precision that we normally wouldn't sort of be willing to put up with on other comparably challenging problems that, because when sort of asked to say, okay, what are some examples of misinformation, the range is really all over the place. And I think pinning that down is actually going to be crucial for sort of actually figuring out how we want to study it. Just to kind of lapse into sort of, examples, I think, a key distinction is between misinformation versus, say, differential salience, right? So, you know, a canonical thing that the media would often sort of report people consuming on social media during the election would be, say, you know, YouTube compilations of, you know, the same politician having sort of, you know, lapses of memory, saying dumb things, et cetera. You know, it's sort of one campaign rally after another and one interview after another, you know, and you string these together and you make a kind of compelling 2-minute clip of all the, you know, sort of, you know, dumb 5 to 10 second snippets of things all strung together. Now, and then people said, you know, this is an example of the kind of thing that they're very, very upset about that is being shared on social media. But you have to ask, okay, so is that misinformation? I mean, those clips were not doctored. That politician did really have those memory lapses, did really say all those dumb things. I think people's unhappiness is that of all the things you could be worrying about in the world right now, is sort of cherry picking these particular things the way you should be spending your time, especially if you're spending potentially hours per day consuming media like this, right? So if we were to try to step back and say, what is that an instance of? You know, it's not necessarily getting things wrong on a true false quiz the way we normally think of misinformation. All of those things really did happen. It might more be that there's a distribution of information out there that we think approximates the distribution of sort of relevant information in the world. And we're concerned if people spend all of their time in some thin part of the tail of this multidimensional distribution. And then we often take that situation and we call it misinformation. But I think at that point, we're pretty far from any reasonable definition of misinformation. We're talking about something else that may be very harmful for society. But I think it seems important to sort of accurately diagnose or even just to taxonomize what are the phenomena we're talking about. And again, like one of the people, one of the references on one of my slides, Claire Wardle is someone who's, you know, begun trying sort of some of these taxonomies. I think there's much more to do there to actually reach a sort of, you know, sort of consensus on that. But I think this idea of trying to separate out the constituent parts of these effects is only at the beginning, and it's very important.
Okay, great, thanks. So actually, like I think this kind of view of like misinformation as more as like the information distribution distortion is to me kind of interesting, but like in some ways inevitable. That's what Matt also mentioned, is that like essentially neural networks, the social networks distort the information by themselves, and kind of then of course then you would need to think, okay, is this distortion kind of natural, or is it kind of doing something that is more kind of misleading? But like I actually would not I would be curious to see how far, you know, how much further we can kind of push this kind of thinking of like how to define maybe information manipulation. But yeah, anyway, but yeah, again, I totally agree that there is this kind of normative question of like, you know, what constitutes misinformation. So let's kind of back away from this for a moment, just so we don't don't get there for the rest of the discussion. So let's think about the other related kind of concept that, like, you know, some of you mentioned in your talks, is this notion of echo chambers. So if you think about the echo chambers and about polarization, how much evidence do we have that indeed these networks are like tend to have a lot of echo chambers, and kind of, and again, there is a question of, you know, how much of this is natural, like kind of, you know, in the real world, we also tend to live in the, you know, neighborhoods we like, which kind of leads to some kind of echo chamber effect. So kind of, do we have like, where are we in the understanding of this phenomena in the in the context of social media? So maybe this time we will start with Matt, and then John, and then Lars.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing we do have fairly good data on is how introspective people's networks are, in the sense that they tend to be mostly linked to people who are like-minded, and that's a long-standing study in sociology. I mean, it's not new, and it's something that has been around for millennia in terms of human behaviors, and it happens for natural reasons. And you know, we're pushed together partly because these are the people that we would naturally interact with. People are put in schools by age. We live in neighborhoods that depend on how much we can afford. We end up working with other people who have similar educational backgrounds because we're working in the same profession. We end up, you know, talking to other people about, for looking to people for advice because they are going through similar things. So if you're a young parent, you talk to other young parents. You know, all these things push people naturally together. And I think that there's some of these are quite beneficial and useful, but they also have these side effects of creating the kinds of echo chambers that we've been talking about. And I think there's two ways to think about how we can overcome some of this. One is simply to educate people as to how biased the views are that they're getting relative to the more general population. And that's not easy to do, but I think, just having people being aware of this. And, I think that as John, there's a nice study that came out by Pennycook and Eccles and others that was, it's gone viral on Twitter recently, which was recently published in Nature, just telling, sort of priming people to think about accuracy can affect what they share and so forth. And instead of just sharing stuff that they're getting from close by, if they start thinking about accuracy, they might change things. And so small nudges can actually help people in understanding how introspective their networks are and giving people a better view of, okay, look, this is what you're seeing and this is what the rest of the world is seeing. And just making that clearer to people, I think could be a starting point without having to do too much rewiring or something. So a lot of it's just exposure and being aware of what's going on. But I think it's something that's natural in human structures for a number of reasons. And it's not something that we want to throw away because it helps people in certain instances, but it has these perverse side effects. And so we need to understand how we can deal with the negative impact without throwing out the positive impacts of these.
So actually, could you just very briefly say, what are the positive impacts of that? Because usually you talk about echo chambers as a negative thing by definition. So what are the positive aspects?
I mean, here's an example. So, at universities, we're trying to recruit students who are first generation students whose families have never gone to university and who might have lower incomes and so forth. Okay. Well, who is a person that can give them the best advice on how to deal with what their life is going to be like in a university that is going to be a completely different kind of experience to them than anything they've seen before? It's somebody else who has the same background. It's not somebody who comes from a very wealthy, privileged background who knows a lot, it's somebody who is going to face the same challenges. So having people with very similar backgrounds and very similar viewpoints can be very enlightening in terms of learning. And understanding what's going to happen. And that's very useful to have those people in touch with each other. But it also means that those people's viewpoints are naturally going to be the same, and the news sources that they might have access to might be the same. And so, the diversity of the news that they get can be reduced because of that. And so on the one hand, the quality of the signal that you get from somebody who's very similar is higher, but the diversity in somebody that you get from somebody similar is lower. And so there's a trade-off between those things. And we don't want to throw out the high quality and just give people the diversity aspect of it. So we need both, but we need to figure out when we need one and when we need the other.
Great, thank you. It was super helpful. John?
Yeah, I mean, I think, this always has to start, I guess, from where Matt started, namely the principle of homophily is incredibly powerful, that we tend to associate with people like us, both because circumstances put us together, as Matt said, grades are organized by age, and not arbitrarily, but for reasons that we can all sort of think of, and then choice homophily, that we seek out people who are similar to us because they may be, just affectively that may be preferable to us, and also they may be the most useful sources of information in a number of the scenarios that Matt mentioned. So I guess I would sort of start from that same base point. And then, I think obviously the question is sort of, I think there's still a lot we don't understand about the role that different technologies, play in sort of amplifying or reducing homophily, in a way that I think there are forces within them that are pulling in both directions, right? I mean, there's the ability to do much more targeted selection based on interest. There's also, the fact that we're exposed to, a much wider range of potential information, and so there's the potential in there to move in both directions. I think there's also a lot more empirical work I think that has to be done on what is the effect of bringing divergent views. So I think when we think about echo chambers, we think about it for this particular slice of, say, people forming political opinions. And I think one important thing from Laura's talk, for example, is to remember that that's a particular use case of some of these social media, but many people are using this for, other purposes. They're using it to connect with friends, they're using it to get health advice from people who are, have similar health conditions than they do. They're using it to, span geographic distance that is hard to span by other means. They're using it to connect with interests that are completely fringe in their own geographic locale, but which exist globally, in which they wouldn't have access to otherwise. So there are lots of reasons why you might want to seek out like-minded people. And I think, the multiplexity of the network is such that this is all happening in the same place. But if we take that narrow slice of political information, I think there's a lot more empirical work that has to be done on what is the actual effect of bringing divergent views into contact. I think sometimes we get to the point of saying, if we could break down echo chambers and bring opposing views into contact, and then we sort of stop there. But at that point, we end up with this extremely hard empirical question of behavioral sciences, which is, the way in which the information is framed or presented, the affordances you provide around that interaction can dramatically change things. And so, there's a number of interesting papers like this work by Ed Glaser and Cass Sunstein, for example, on, the surprising effects that can happen if you bring opposing views into contact and sort of do it haphazardly, that doesn't necessarily cause consensus to emerge. It doesn't necessarily cause people to moderate their views. And that sometimes, other mechanisms are effective, such as the role of surprising validators in their terminology, where somebody who normally agrees with you takes a different point of view, that can sometimes have a bigger effect than someone who always disagrees with you taking a divergent point of view. And so I think, all of these fine-grained details of how different divergent views are brought into contact once we get on the other side of echo chambers are all extremely hard questions that there's a lot we don't know about.
Great, thank you, John. Lars, what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, I think other people have referenced this paper a couple times already, and I guess like one of the graphs in John's talk was from this. But I think like the big question probably shouldn't be like to what extent are, I guess, like people exposed to content they agree with on social media, but like to what extent is that exposure is kind of like above and beyond what they would normally get, either through their sort of friend graph, outside of social media, or from the TV stations that they watch or the radio they listen to. And I think it's important to kind of like make sure, considering that broader context, and not just like is social media a filter bubble, but is it differentially exposing people more to things that are going to to John's point, like maybe not just be the content that they would agree with, but also have an impact on their opinions and cause them to be more polarized or things like that. Because I think the reality is that people are going to self-select things often that they tend to agree with, and they're going to watch the TV news stations that they tend to agree with. And I think the evidence suggests that like social media is not significantly sort of different than that. If anything, I think that there's some evidence that you're exposed to a slightly larger set of people. I think Matt mentioned this earlier, that it's easier to keep in touch now with people who are farther away and some of your weak ties. And so whereas I think in the past you may have been spending a larger fraction of your time with your top few close friends, you're now able to keep tabs on at least and get information from a set of people who you may or may not agree with. And I think from the work in the paper that's already been cited, like does seem to suggest that people, if anything, are in some cases getting more kind of diverse opinions from that broader social network, as opposed to Facebook being, I guess Facebook in particular in this case, but I think probably is true of social media more broadly, being more of a filter bubble or echo chamber than I think like what you would expect, given people's tendencies to sort of seek out information that they're at least partially aligned with.
I want to follow up on that a little, just a moment. If that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So I think this is an important point, and I think as Lars is pointing out, we can one benchmark is what would naturally occur without social media, and how is social media changing that? And I think an important aspect of that is not to say that what would occur naturally is a good thing. So we already have there's a lot of homophily built into our networks, and it's possible that that one way we can view this is more as an opportunity rather than something that's hurting the world. So social media give us a chance to form more of those weak ties. It's a technology that can be used to give us more data on what's going on, and it's an opportunity for us to improve the way that that democratic institutions function, which is having an informed electorate make choices. And to what extent can we leverage this, as opposed to to what extent is it hurting things? And I think part of what's happening is, around the world, we're seeing a confluence of two things happening at the same time. One is that there's growing polarization for a lot of economic reasons that have nothing to do with social media. That that there's a greater divergence between people who have education and people who don't, and we're seeing growing inequality in income and so forth. And there's a lot of pressures from that cause political discomfort around the world, and we're seeing a rise of populism for the same reasons in a lot of countries. And that's completely separate from this. But in terms of getting a better political dialogue, this is more an opportunity than, and to some extent, this naturally happens. And I think there is a question of how much is it changing the world, but also what can we do to use this to make for better discourse? And I think that's a question that frames it a little differently and might be useful in going forward.
Yes, so that's a point. That's actually a question I wanted to ask a bit later. So before we get there, let's just put a pin in this, because I think this is a very important way of turning the perspective how we think about it. Like, not think about it as a danger, but also let's think about it as an opportunity. But before we get there, like, I wanted to ask one question, which again I was wondering about quite a bit. So again, clearly, like, we have this phenomenon, and we can, like, it's not clear like how crisply we understand what this phenomenon, like what different phenomena are, and kind of, and to, like, essentially, like, what is the scale. But there's also the kind of causality question, like, kind of, to what extent what we are observing is really the result of maybe unfortunate, or like not kind of foreseeing enough in the terms of the choice of the algorithms that drive the behavior of this social network, and how much this is kind of an inevitable effect of, if you just suddenly connect, like, make it possible for people across the world to instantly connect, and kind of, and do it, and essentially connect these people, like, you can connect now to everyone, and you can, like, do it in a frictionless way. Like, how much this will be, what we are observing will be inevitable. So how much is the part that maybe we are not, maybe did not converge to the right algorithms yet, and how much this is, okay, whenever you connect this many people, it's inevitable to happen. So kind of, so do we have an understanding of of this question? Because I think this is also something I really would like to understand. So maybe let's start with John, and then Lars, and then Matt.
Yeah, I mean, obviously all these questions are related, so I would go back to Lars and Matt's points, and the point Matt just made about, I think social media also provides an opportunity. I think in part obviously there's a lot that we don't understand. Again, I would point to some of the papers we've been discussing that say we can dissect the effect into sort of the role of algorithms versus the role of differential content production versus the role of homophily versus the role of individual selection. And when we sort of separate all those out, I would say there isn't a lot of evidence thus far that necessarily that the algorithms are the ones that are adding most of the effect here. One way to sort of do that without one kind of source of intuition for this might also be to look at different platforms and how they turn out differently. So just to take examples of platforms that use a lot of algorithmic curation of their content versus platforms that are essentially chronological in their content, and ask, are the outcomes extremely different on these two platforms? And I think a lot of people's subjective experience would be that they aren't necessarily that different in terms of the amount of the sort of sense that there might be echo chambers, the sense that there's a lot of homophily, and so I think part of it would be to look at sort of differences. On the other hand, you might see differences in the norms that emerge for reasons that have nothing to do with algorithms, right? So we can certainly think of platforms where there is less, say, political controversy, and we could ask how it got that way, right? Platforms that may be running similar algorithms, or two platforms that are running no algorithms at all, where one of them has much more contentious content than the other, and you sort of begin to ask whether there's also a role being played here by self-fulfilling equilibria, that if people expect to find a certain kind of content on one platform, that's where they go for it, and that's where an ecosystem therefore develops to produce more content. To Lars's point about, I think each of these platforms ends up developing its own internal set of media producers who focus on that. So I think we can also get divergent outcomes for those symmetry breaking types of reasons. And I think that's part of why it's so hard to sort of separate the effective algorithms from all of these other forces. But again, I'd be curious what Lars and Matt have to say also.
Okay, great. So Lars, what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer. I mean, I can agree with most of what John said, and thinking about it a little bit is just like, it's a counterfactual that I think is very difficult for me to sort of really wrap my head around and sort of have a firm opinion of like what would happen if everything was totally different. So I think, yeah, I'm not sure that I have sort of like a firm thought. I mean, I do think that from, I guess I can maybe speak to a little bit of, you know, some of the work that we've done on Facebook, but I think the challenge is probably that the like empirical evidence that we have is based on like shorter term sort of experiments or sort of like observations where, you know, you can go and sort of study like what would happen if you perturb the system in this sort of like significant way, and, you know, you stop ranking things and you showed them all in reverse chronological, and, you know, a bunch of things would be different, but it wouldn't be like that dramatically different. But it's very hard to sort of extrapolate from that to like what would happen if, you know, you launched that change to the entire world and then waited 5 years. I think that would have kind of like dramatic ramifications. And this kind of goes back to some of the points maybe earlier about like the incentives, where now I think like an obvious incentive for that would create is like, rather than trying to create the best content, you try to create as much as possible so that you can be on top of the chronologically sorted newsfeed, which you wouldn't see in sort of like a short-term sort of empirical study, but I think that's sort of an obvious incentive. So I think that's where it gets like a little bit challenging to reason about like what would happen in these sort of like other scenarios, because, and maybe it's a little bit more theoretical also, I mean, to the point of you need to kind of like think about, okay, like if you were to change things in this dramatic way, there's probably no empirical study that can really speak to that, but you could reason about the incentives that that would create and the likely ways that the various actors in the system would respond. Yeah.
Yeah, again, to say, of course, like it's really difficult to say what the right like counterfactual should be here. Like, kind of what is the generic content network? Like, is it just like you really like you connect to random set of random people, and like, yeah, it's I guess a good question, but kind of it just really like, you know, there could be a conclusion that maybe connecting, you know, a couple of billion people in this frictional way is just not a great idea, or at least whenever you do it, you know, one way or another, you will have to deal with certain effects that will emerge, no matter content moderation or this like on kind of modulating the structure of the networks. Okay, I guess that's what I'm trying to push, but yeah, I know this is not a, you know, crisply stated question, because yeah, the counterfactual here is a bit unclear.
Although,
okay,
actually,
Mark,
if I could,
what are your thoughts?
Oh, sorry. So Alexander, if I could ask you a question, I guess when you say these effects might happen whenever you connect 2 billion people in this way, I mean, I guess the sort of question one level beyond that is, first of all, these 2 billion people were already connected in some way. These 2 billion people were already consuming media. And so I guess, you know, the question is always sort of, what is the differential change that we're trying to study here? In the sense that we all already had highly segmented media consumption. We already had polarized political opinions. Are we talking about a change in quantity or a change in quality? I mean, we can see quantitative changes, but it isn't that there's been a discrete change. I mean, people were already connected. The broadcast media already spanned the world and reached audiences that were in the billions. So it feels a little more difficult to separate out the before versus after here.
Yes, that's a great thing, by the way. And I would like view like what we had, you know, let's say before emergence of, you know, Facebook and Twitter as the normal. So yeah, so there were media and there was people, and there was an interesting thought that like, I think one thing that we had before, so we had many of these effects of echo chambers and kind of like, you know, people wanted to hear something, so they had special, you know, media outlet that kind of caters to them. But like one thing that kind of was, again, and this is just something I thought, I'm not sure how much I supported the saying, the difference was that there we had shared understanding. Even if this understanding was skewed in some ways, like kind of you were roughly watching the same news, which again, I don't think it's exactly true, but this is kind of the opinion I heard, versus like now in the age of social media, like we each one understanding. When I even, like forget Facebook, if I even go to Google and I search for something, what I am seeing is a different world to what you are seeing. And kind of this extreme personalization of the experiences also seems to be like the new effect. But,
right. Yeah.
The question is a question, yeah.
No, good. Yeah, it's just I think that's sort of the thing that I think we want to unpack more carefully, because so I mean, there's actually a fascinating paper of Genskow, Shapiro, and Taddy in Econometrica that looks at polarization in political speech, for example. So they had this very intuitive measure of if I listen to 1 minute worth of a politician speaking, how accurately can I guess which party they belong to? And that measure was sort of bumped along. It was sort of relatively, it kind of had random fluctuations. And then there was sort of a knee in the curve in the early 1990s, and it began to shoot upward, right? And the knee in that curve was not the growth of social media. It was really a set of essentially tactical decisions around political messaging that happened in the early 1990s, sort of concurrent with the growth in cable news. And so when we think about things that sort of bent the curve, social media may be one of those, but there are other points along the way, right? I think that's the sense in which sort of treating this as a before versus after kind of discrete question is where we miss some of the subtlety, I think, in what's going on.
Yeah, so that's exactly what I wanted to kind of highlight, that exactly like we might be kind of conflating, impact of different things with the impact of social media, and like that's also kind of something that I think it would be great to have more clarity, because I think the public discourse is all tangled together. Matt, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, and I think this really opens the economic questions up pretty widely, and I think economies of scope and scale matter, and what the study that John was just referring to, one of the key things was, the cable, the widespread reach of cable allowed more niche news services to develop, right? So you used to have just a few key news services, and then you had a proliferation of them, and they could begin to tailor their content towards specific political views and subsets of the population and still survive. So they could reach more people at a greater distance, and so they could survive at a smaller scale. And that change, I think, is something that we're seeing more broadly. So, the music industry is changing, book publishing is changing fundamentally. When you look at the way that people can create content on YouTube or other kinds of things, video creation, it's just a completely different playing field these days. And so somebody can create something relatively cheaply and then reach a broader audience. And so that's sort of like giving everybody in the world a microphone at the same time. And then we need something to sort out all these microphones and all these people screaming, and virality is part of that, but it depends a lot on how it gets moderated. And that used to happen through editorial teams at news services. It used to happen through music executives who made decisions on which bands to promote and how to promote them. And now it's an open playing field. And I think the beauty of it is that evens things out. But the difficulty is that we need to make sure that we do filter things in some ways, because you can't listen to everybody else in the world at the same time. And so we need filters, and they've been pretty much designed in a competitive industry now, where people are trying to vie for content and for people's attention. And I think we haven't figured out the economics of this yet, as to what are the negative effects of that and what are the positive effects of that. And I think there are effects on both sides that we need to figure.
Right. I think we did not do any succession planning for what to do if we lost our moderator.
Yeah.
Alexander is back. Okay.
No. I'm here. It's great.
Power in my apartment just flickered, so hopefully everything will be good back online in a moment, but I am on my phone for now. So we are, the show must go on. So okay, so let me just so essentially the question is, okay, now, now that imagine, okay, let's not think about only the is there a way, empower the users So in particular, Matt already had this example that's saying, maybe if we show to people, look, what you are seeing is not everything that is out there. Is there a way, kind of like, are there any other interventions that we might consider to actually really kind of, as Matt said, kind of allow the users on one hand of the effect, but also to the effects of of like the polarization and kind of the undesirable effects. So what are the interventions that we might consider? In particular, just I want to bring up a study of David Rand, I believe, Adam Berlinski, and others here at MIT and beyond, that kind of show that on Twitter, people actually have, and that's already mentioned, is that like they have actually pretty good idea of what is misinformation or what isn't. Just like you just need to nudge them to make them think for a moment. And in particular, one potentially fairly useful way for doing content moderation is just like crowdsourcing the opinions of the people of the actual users, and it apparently works pretty well, on par with if you had a panel of experts kind of reviewing the news. So in general, like kind of so if we now kind of switch our thinking to kind of opportunities versus only the dangers, like what are each one of you, what kind of opportunities do you envision? And again, I maybe will start with Matt because he already had some ideas, maybe he has more, and then maybe we will do John and then Lars.
Sure, and I think the opportunities here that we can basically pull together people and we can see what information is out there, and we can begin to give people more diverse news feeds and offer them to them. I think the hard part about this is the way in which we can do this, literally just by saying, okay, look, here's what's going on somewhere else, is that's not necessarily what people are going to be captivated by. And so, that this can be a little bit at odds with a profit driven industry in social media. So offering people the experience that might be best in terms of a democratic conversation is different from offering them what's best in terms of getting them on that platform for the most time and the most engaged. And that means that one has to figure out the economics of this, not just the say, okay, look, we suggested that we start putting in these kinds of buttons for people to be able to click on that will offer them a more diverse news feed. It's how do we incentivize people to do that, and how do we incentivize the platforms to offer that if that's something that's not necessarily instantly attractive to people. And that's a harder nut to crack. And that, it's not something that you necessarily want to regulate, but it's not something that you can just leave to work on its own.
Okay, great. Thank you, Matt. John?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is going to take advantage of this idea of multiplexity as the idea that Matt brought up earlier, that our individual social relations tend to sort of carry multiple things across them, and we tend to use them for multiple sort of goals in our lives. And so I think, in the end, I think the first opportunity for social media, as it always has been, is to sort of let people try to accomplish what they're trying to do in their lives. And so, if that's, people, sort of, high schoolers with passions for certain things, who don't have that in their local environment, but can find that online. If it's people with, new parents looking for advice, people with, chronic medical conditions looking for advice, extended families trying to stay in touch. I think all of these are sort of, things where people sort of often return to social media, for certain purposes. And, I think that brings people into contact with others who are not like them in a variety of different ways, right? That if you're part of a group that has a passion for sort of, cooking a certain kind of cuisine, that's going to often suggest homophily along certain dimensions, but it's going to suggest heterogeneity along other dimensions. And so, and again, not wanting to keep making analogies to sort of older eras of mass communication, but, just to keep remembering that none of these are, truly new kinds of changes. That, when TV first appeared, one of the sort of, one of the profound effects of TV is that, lots of people had just never heard what other people far away from them sounded like, right? So you have a character, you have TV news coverage from somewhere, you have, characters on TV from, and it's just, suddenly you could see what the inside of other people's houses looked like. You could see how they talked. You could hear how they talked. And, and this is just a way of bringing people into contact. So I think that's a gradient that just seems like in the long run, bring people together around shared interests, and then trying to sort of leverage the heterogeneity that you find in that groups is, I think has always been an opportunity, which, I think we need to figure out how to take advantage of.
Great, thank you. Lars?
Yeah, I guess building on something Matt said, I think there's maybe like worth bucketing into a couple of different types of interventions where, I think there are some cases where people have sort of, I guess what they would describe sort of like regrettable or like regretted sharing of, it's not that they sort of like were, necessarily aligned with the content that they were sharing or felt like, it was, fully accurate because they like did all their homework and they wanted to share it, but more that, they made a decision to sort of propagate some content over the network without being necessarily like, taking the time to do the sort of like full due diligence to decide whether or not it was factually accurate and things like that. And so I think there are sort of opportunities to help, provide more information on like the sources or, this is, I guess, like to address the sort of like regretted sharing where like, to what extent can you reduce the number of times where people share content that if they were only sort of more informed, they wouldn't have shared. And like in hindsight, like with the benefit of more information, like they would say like, oh yeah, like I hadn't done that. I think that is sort of like one bucket. And then the other bucket, which I agree with Ben, is sort of like the harder bucket is like, I think like, are there things that, even with the full benefit of like all the information in the world, the people wouldn't sort of like change their views and they would be polarized. And there, I think like showing them alternative viewpoints like doesn't necessarily help. And I think there's some research suggesting that like it could actually make things worse and sort of like cause people to dig in. And that's where I think, to John's point is like, rather than trying to just show people alternative viewpoints alongside the content that they're seeing, pursuing kind of like other avenues that are going to focus on sort of the outcomes that you want. It's not just about the sort of like what shows up in the stream, but also like what are the sort of outcomes of people sort of becoming less polarized and having kind of interactions where they can come to sort of be empathetic with the alternative viewpoints and things like that.
Yeah, great, thank you. So yes, so exactly. So again, this always gets back to this question, which again, I think John stated at the beginning. It's just like question is like, and that Lars is thinking hard about. It's like what people actually want out of the engagement with the social media. It's like, and just giving them opportunity is one thing, but like how do we kind of align it with with what they actually want and want to kind of take advantage of. So kind of just to now to play to this economic angle. So just like I have actually a quick question in some ways. So yeah, so we mentioned that like incentives at play, and again, I'm also like a big incentives believer. Like especially like for such big systems, we need to have incentives in the right place. There is like I think regulation alone. I guess regulation can create incentive overall. Like yeah, you just want to make things be advantageous to all the stakeholders to behave the way we would like them to behave. But how much do you think that the current I would say the revenue model that all the social media platforms follow, essentially your revenue comes from advertisement, and then because of that you would definitely need to keep the users engaged as much as you can. Like how much this is the kind of like how much this is a driver of what we are observing? Are there any alternative models of of getting revenue that maybe would lead to at least different effects? Because I was thinking, okay, so we can use subscription paying subscription fees, and but like in some ways even then you as as Facebook, you still want the users for more because then they see more value in it, and then they will be willing to pay the subscription fee. So are there any thoughts? Are you aware of, or do you have any thoughts, or are you aware of any thoughts of like what could be the alternative kind of revenue models for social media platforms that might lead to different results? And maybe I will start with Matt, and then with Lars, and then with John.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that has been around forever almost in terms of as long as media have been around, they've been basically sold under two models, and often a combined model, which is you used to sell newspapers, you sell magazines, they have advertisements in them, and they have subscription fees. And it's really a price discrimination problem. It's a sort of a classic economic problem of, there's some people who are more tolerant, would rather not pay up front, but are willing to tolerate advertisements. There's other people that would be willing to pay more and would like to see fewer ads. And that kind of system has been used in selling things for a long time. And I think it's similar to the way social media are being packaged and sold now. And you see some mixture of that in most of these things, right? You can pay something extra and get your ads taken out, or you can do that on YouTube, you can do that on Pandora, you can, whatever media you're consuming, you've got some options of this form. And I think that it's hard. One aspect that we haven't gone through, and I think is important and sort of lurking here, is there's another piece of this that's new to the social media, is the amount of information that's collected about the users at this time. And that is another part of what is paying for the services, which is resale of some of the information and use of some of that information in better targeting advertising and so forth. And the one part of the puzzle that I don't think is well studied is what happens if you change the property rights on that. So if you give the user all the property rights to their information, and it has to be purchased from the platforms, as opposed to it's owned by the platforms at this point in time, except in certain countries, that changes the way that the whole system works. And that's something that I guess that is used to different extents in different platforms, but another way that generates revenue, and the one that's probably most original in terms of what's happening now.
Great, thank you. Lars?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I guess I don't think I have a great sort of answer. I mean, comparing the two things that you mentioned of subscriptions or sort of advertising, I'm not sure that like those are all that different in like a lot of ways. And that, to a large extent, in both cases, you're trying to provide the most value to your user base, like along a number of dimensions. One of them maybe is like a little bit more towards like how much time are people spending so that you can show more ads, and the other one is like you try and avoid canceling subscriptions. But at the end of the day, I think that like the optimization that you would do is mostly similar. And so I think as long as you're sort of like rooted in like you're trying to create a service that provides as much value to people as possible, and that is the sort of like North Star, it's a little hard to see like the details of like subscription or advertising or some of the like in between are sort of going to have a huge impact on all the other topics that we've been talking about up to this point. I think you would have to go like much further afield, I guess. It seems like to me before you would start to get sort of like these issues not being, you have to bring back the sort of like editorial page, and it would no longer be, I guess, like kind of close to what it is today before you would really start to sort of change things in a huge way.
Yeah, so that's why I said that, like, in some ways, I don't see the subscription services that much different. I guess if I'm trying now just to be creative and radical, you could think that, okay, maybe the government will decide that this is like a public infrastructure, and will actually, like, the government will kind of, fund the social media and for some public good. I guess that's, it's very far from where we are now, but I guess, if you want to be creative, that could change things, I guess. And then kind of the questions of, okay, how do we optimize for the society as opposed to individual users? I guess then it would be more to bear. It's a little bit, I guess, just as an analogy to like, to PBS versus, commercial TV stations. And I think that we see the difference there in the good quality, well, the type of content. Anyway, John, what are your thoughts here?
I mean, I guess the other lever, I mean, again, even if, say in some extreme example where this was, publicly funded, somebody is still deciding what content you like. At some point, there's more content that you can feasibly consume, and somebody's making a selection decision for you. And so, that's going to be true under any of these models. I mean, I guess one thing, of course, that's another axis is who's creating the content, right? So, like a sort of Netflix type model is, they're creating content for you that you then consume. So is the platform basically a gigantic switching station in the middle where all of us come with the content we want to share? It passes through the switching station and ends up in the hands of other people. So I put my photos there, and people who want to see my photos because they're my friends or because they think I take interesting photos, they go see them. I create posts, and people who are interested in what's going on in my life see them. Versus the platform itself is sort of trying to create content that it thinks will attract users. And in some sense, I think one of our definitions of social media is that it's the former and not the latter, right? If it's creating its own content, then it's some other, some other kind of platform. But I think obviously those lines are blurring a bit, right? We see platforms that start out saying we're just a pipe, discovering that maybe there's some value in also creating their own content. And so I think that that's another sort of axis along which we could think about some of these questions.
Yeah, sounds great. So we are getting close to the end, and unfortunately, as a part of this, mishap in the middle, I actually lost the chat. So I just only remember one question, and I will actually connect it with my question. So in some question, if I remember correctly, the question was around, how. Sort of like how, in some ways we kind of lost, there's a lot of focus on the content moderation question, but and the question is why, maybe there are many other questions that we should be focusing on in the context of social media. So I guess the question that connects to this that I would like to ask is saying, again, and this is the usual what will happen in the future kind of question that no one likes, but it's always entertaining to ask if you don't have to answer them, is that in your prediction, if you go fast forward 20 years from now and we look back at everything that happened around the social media and social networks and so on, so what do you think is likely, or at least has a chance of becoming really the highest order bit, kind of the things that really kind of we say, okay, the one thing or the two things about social media that we learned from this 30 years of history is this, or this is the impact they have. So any thought about that? So maybe I will start with Matt, then Lars, and then John.
I mean, it's always hard to look that far into the future because otherwise we'd be there. But I think, one thing that's happening right now that I think is happening very rapidly and this, John just mentioned is, content creation is changing, right? So the ability of people now to be streaming, shows from different sources and so forth is changing the way that that's been made. It's changing the way books are being openly published. It's changing the way music is being produced and put on. And so we're seeing a proliferation of content that's being produced at cheaper rates and from a much wider variety of sources than through old large studios or music businesses that had economies of scope and scale and distribution. And so I think that that's a fundamental change in sort of the way that the global economy is working and content is being produced. And to some extent that's wonderful. And the flip side of it is that has to be moderated. And we're struggling right now with exactly what's the best way to do the moderation. And maybe it involves some, PBS sort of version of a media service, and other kinds of things might be growing up. But right now we're sort of in the wild west of this process, and I don't know how it'll play out. But I'm guessing that when we look back and look at the proliferation of content, that'll be a major milestone in terms of how much content was produced by how many different people around the world, and how widely it could be consumed. And things that can be produced in a very small scale can go viral. That's really unique to this time period.
Great, thank you, Lars.
Well, the first thing that I think is obvious is that we'll all be consuming social media in virtual reality from our flying cars. Beyond that, though, I think that the biggest shift that at least, and maybe this is not 20 years, because I think you're already seeing it today, is the one that Matt alluded to. Is I think the kind of democratization of content creation, which I think goes well beyond the sort of content moderation question, and is really about sort of there's between TikTok and YouTube and Instagram and Facebook, there's just a huge number of people who I think are being quite successful in I think like finding their somewhat niche audience and being able to produce content that those people love and get millions, or in some cases hundreds of millions of views, and kind of make a living through that in a way that I think was not previously possible for sort of like a single person or a single person and a couple of helpers to sort of do in the past without a big sort of media deals and the studios and things like that. And so I think you have a lot of examples of people who are already doing that now, and it's kind of a clearly growing trend that I think will only continue and will, to a certain extent, compete with some of the existing sort of like much larger franchises that are producing content for people's sort of attention and mindshare. And the ability to kind of like build your audience on these platforms and then reach the sort of like right people because of the personalization that happens, I think is only going to sort of like continue as more and more people sort of figure out how to build sort of small businesses around this.
Great, thanks. John?
Yeah, I agree with all those. And I think, I think part of this also, if we think about, how content creation is changing is, a sort of dislocation of all of this from geography, and I think, the fact that we, if you think about sort of even just the last year and the way in which we've sort of worked online, worked remotely, the kinds of things that we've done remotely that we used to take as sort of axiomatic that we had to do through physical co-presence. The fact that there were certain kinds of meetings that we thought we had to have by like physically transporting your body across the country so as to have this meeting. And then we discovered that, and obviously that was sort of a question of the evolution of social norms, right? Like there was almost a kind of signaling value, to use an economics term, or, a kind of, the fact that you were gathering physically was kind of a statement of we were all willing to pay the upfront cost of doing that. There was a social norm around that. If you did things remotely, it was viewed as a cheaper form of engagement, a kind of less committed form of engagement. And obviously the current circumstances have sort of forced on us, it's taken away the signaling dimension of physical co-presence. We have to do things virtually, and we've discovered that actually some of them work perfectly well that way. And so I think we're going to be seeing the effects of that also. And I think that, I think it's a trend that relates to this other trend of, the sort of, growth of people who build audiences, on TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, and so forth, that those are often kind of increasingly international audiences. I think, there are sort of many technologies that come together, the increasing, the fact that machine translation allows you to kind of translate between languages, sort of much more cheaply, that it gives you a starting point that a human being can sort of correct with a very light touch, potentially eventually something that genuinely resembles real time, means I think that the kind of ad hoc audiences that people in these domains assemble are going to be increasingly international, aren't going to sort of have the language barriers that you would have had 20 or 30 years ago, which also is going to contribute to sort of a dislocation of these things from geographic constraints. Again, all of this could go in some other direction, but I think all of these are clearly forces that are at work.
Okay, great, thank you. So yes, I think this idea of like, well, this kind of this highlighting theme of exactly this is about like democratization of content creation is like very interesting, and I actually like that now that you laid it out, I find it definitely very compelling, which is very interesting, because that's not what we talked about for the last hour and a half, right? So in some ways, that's exactly the matter of perspective might change about like, I guess the content moderation, like especially was like flared as a topic because of all the political connotations of that, and like how much this currently we all resonate with it. But like this is very useful to kind of realize that there is much more here than just just the things that seem to be in front of us. So anyway, thank you so much for participating in this event. Thank you so much to coming and talking to us about this. I think this was kind of very both entertaining and informative to me. So I definitely learned stuff, and I always like to learn stuff. I guess I still think that like this area is very fascinating, and I still feel like, as you also said, like I think we are just scratching the surface. But hopefully we are making progress, and we are actually getting somewhere there. So hopefully, like if we meet again in like 2 years from now, our understanding will evolve quite a bit, and hopefully we'll have
a new kind of discussion then. Thank you so much.